Hello everyone, and welcome back to our final presentation on the circulatory system. By now, you should have watched the lab recordings that cover the anatomy of the blood vessels as well as the location of blood vessels. At this point, we have covered the majority of the concepts related to the cardiovascular system. We've discussed the heart, its different chambers, the pathway that blood takes as it travels through the heart, as well as cardiac function. And we have now also seen the structure of blood vessels and the locations that our major blood vessels can be found in the body. So to place the finishing touches on the cardiovascular system as a whole, in this lab presentation, we're going to discuss a few special circulations. We should have a fairly good idea about how the heart and the blood vessels work together to transport oxygen out to our tissues. We know now that arteries take blood away from the heart and veins take blood back to the heart. And in capillaries, we're going to find gas exchange taking place. We've talked extensively about the systemic circulation, as it is these concepts that most accurately characterize the cardiovascular system. But to top off the blood vessels, we're going to discuss 4 very specialized circulatory routes that blood will take within the circulatory system. We tend to consider the systemic circulation as normal in the cardiovascular system. And when some type of circulatory route deviates from our systemic circulation, we consider that to be a special circulation. The special circulations that we'll discuss in this presentation will include the circle of Willis, the pulmonary circulation, the hepatic portal circulation, and the fetal circulation. All of these circulatory routes are part of the cardiovascular system, but they will each have a major difference about them that distinguishes them from our systemic circulation. We will still be able to apply most of the concepts that we've learned about the cardiovascular system thus far. But throughout focusing upon these 4 special circulations, we want to pay careful attention to their differences. So the first special circulation that we're going to discuss is the circle of Willis. The circle of Willis can be found at the base of the brain, wrapping around the pituitary gland as well as the optic chiasm. The circle of Willis is described as an arterial anastomosis, which refers to a network of blood vessels that are designed to ensure that blood flow makes its way to the brain. Considering the functions and characteristics of the brain, that is not an organ that can go without oxygen for very long. So in the event of some type of blockage or blood clot getting lodged in the brain, the circle of Willis will help to bring blood flow to those areas that would have potentially ceased receiving blood flow if the circle of Willis was not present. There are 3 different vessels that contribute to the structure of the circle of Willis. We have the internal carotid arteries, the anterior communicating artery, and the posterior communicating artery. The internal carotid arteries can be found right here. These will be a branch off of the common carotid artery that courses up the neck and takes blood to the brain. We'll find our anterior communicating artery, shown right here, connecting these 2 anterior cerebral arteries, and we'll find 2 posterior communicating arteries that can be found here and here. So the circle of Willis can be seen as this arterial structure shown right here. This arterial anastomosis will wrap around the pituitary gland as well as the optic chiasm. And it is the purpose of this anastomosis to make sure that blood can get to different areas of the brain in the event that there is a blockage. After all, that is the sole purpose of an arterial anastomosis. So you can see that the internal carotid arteries can be found here, and they will be the major players that supply most of the blood to the areas that are supplied by the circle of Willis. But the posterior communicating arteries will connect these internal carotid arteries with the posterior cerebral arteries that will branch off from the basilar artery. In the event that there was a blockage in one of the internal carotid arteries that were coursing up from the neck, all of these areas over here that are supplied by this internal carotid artery would become susceptible to oxygen deprivation. So by having this posterior communicating artery on this side, and also having the anterior communicating artery that's linking our 2 anterior cerebral arteries, blood from the other internal carotid artery, or perhaps from the basilar artery, might be able to make it over here and ensure blood flow gets to these areas, so that the lack of blood flow does not lead to a stroke. It would not be incorrect to also consider the anterior cerebral arteries as well as the posterior cerebral arteries as part of the circle of Willis. This structure is our first special circulation. Our second special circulation is in fact the pulmonary circulation, which has been fairly covered up until this point. Our goal in discussing the pulmonary circulation during this presentation is to elaborate on its function and also see in a bit more detail this branch of the cardiovascular system. So we must keep in mind that the pulmonary circulation is much different than the systemic circulation, as the pulmonary circulation is not delivering oxygen to the tissues. It is the sole purpose of the pulmonary circulation to reoxygenate blood that's passing through the lungs. This circulation will not meet the metabolic needs of tissues, because the blood in this circulation is going to be deoxygenated. So it is the sole purpose of this circulation to bring deoxygenated blood from the right side of the heart, where that blood can come in close contact with the oxygen that has been inhaled into the alveoli of the lungs. Thanks to the respiratory membrane, oxygen will diffuse down its concentration gradient into the blood, and carbon dioxide will be released from the deoxygenated blood back into the alveoli where it can be excreted. We will see with the pulmonary circulation that the movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide is different than that of the systemic circulation. In the systemic circulation, when oxygenated blood is pumped out to our tissues, oxygen will move down its concentration gradient into the tissues, and carbon dioxide will move down its concentration gradient from the tissues into the blood. This produces deoxygenated blood that gets pumped back up to the right side of the heart and then into the pulmonary circulation, where oxygen will then diffuse down its concentration gradient into the blood, and carbon dioxide will flow down its concentration gradient out of the blood. Our next topic that will be covered will be the respiratory system, and we're going to introduce the structure of the respiratory tree, as well as the alveoli that are in very close proximity to those pulmonary capillaries that will allow for gas exchange to take place. Alveoli sort of resemble grapes on a vine, and they act as balloons when we inhale and exhale. When we inhale, that brings oxygen into the lungs, and our alveoli are going to inflate. You can see the intricate network of blood vessels that are coursing in such close proximity to each of the alveoli. These are a depiction of the pulmonary capillaries. Let's take a quick second to remember that the blood coming from the right side of the heart is deoxygenated. So the pulmonary arteries will eventually get smaller and smaller and smaller until these become the pulmonary capillaries. So we must remember that it is the pulmonary capillaries that carry deoxygenated blood and also are going to branch to become smaller and smaller and smaller. And eventually this branch will come from the pulmonary arteries. These are eventually going to become capillaries, which will closely wrap around each of our alveoli and facilitate gas exchange. And as the oxygen from the inside of the lungs diffuses into the bloodstream, we're going to have this red blood coursing out back from the lungs, which is demonstrating that oxygenation has taken place here with the pulmonary circulation. So hopefully this picture will help us to see this a little bit clearer. We have the right side of our heart that's going to pump into the pulmonary trunk, which will split into our two pulmonary arteries that are carrying deoxygenated blood. Those pulmonary arteries are going to make their way into the lungs and course through the lungs until they become the pulmonary capillaries and facilitate gas exchange. It is in those capillaries that we'll have reoxygenation of blood, and that's where we get the transition of the blue color to the red color. And so this newly oxygenated blood will eventually enter back into the left side of the heart at the left atrium through the 4 pulmonary veins. This depiction up here will show you the direction of diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide as blood is pumped through the pulmonary capillaries. The main takeaway with the pulmonary circulation is that this circulation does not meet the metabolic needs of tissues and solely functions to reoxygenate deoxygenated blood. So the next special circulation that we're going to discuss is known as the hepatic portal circulation. I very briefly touched on this special circulation at the end of the blood vessel location video. However, I didn't give you much information then, and it is here that we're really going to discuss what this circulation does and why it's considered a special circulation. So the hepatic portal circulation is a branch from our body's systemic circulation. This special route will arise as our systemic arteries bring oxygenated blood out to supply and provide energy for the digestive organs. Considering that our digestive organs will need energy for digestion and absorption, they will need to receive oxygenated blood too. And oxygen delivery will happen in the digestive organs just as it does everywhere else. The blood vessels wrapping around the digestive organs are also responsible for absorbing nutrients that come from the digestive system through absorption. And it is this fact that will tell us that that blood coming from the digestive organs will have to make another stop before it makes its way back to the right side of the heart. So after oxygenated blood supplies the digestive organs and absorption has taken place, we have a new type of blood which would be referred to as oxygen poor but nutrient rich. All of the nutrients from our digestive system have been absorbed into the bloodstream, but there's no oxygen since the oxygen was offloaded to provide energy for the digestive organs. So the nutrients that are now in the blood will have to make a pit stop at the liver to drop off those nutrients for processing. There will in fact be a second capillary bed that can be found in the liver whose primary purpose is to absorb those nutrients that are coming from the digestive organs. Two capillary beds that are in series are often referred to as portal systems, and they are generally connected by what's known as a portal vein. And we see just that here with the hepatic portal system. The hepatic portal vein will collect blood from the organs that are absorbing the nutrients from digestion. And this hepatic portal vein will direct that blood into the liver to pass through the capillaries of the liver known as the liver sinusoids. It is in this capillary bed that those nutrients will be dropped off at the liver, and then through the hepatic veins, that deoxygenated blood can finally make its way back to the heart. The four veins that contribute to the hepatic portal circulation are the gastric vein, the splenic vein, the inferior mesenteric vein, and the superior mesenteric vein. You can see your gastric vein will be coursing along the lesser curvature of the stomach, and the splenic vein will be coming out from the spleen. Our inferior mesenteric vein and our superior mesenteric veins are going to be draining the organs that are suspended within the mesenteries. But what we have in common with all four of these vessels is that they'll all end up meeting here at the hepatic portal vein, where this vein will then take blood into the liver sinusoids to offload those nutrients so that the liver can process them. From here, this capillary bed will end at the hepatic veins, which will dump back into the inferior vena cava. So all in all, the hepatic portal circulation is responsible for extracting the nutrients that come from our digestive organs. These nutrients will be processed in the liver and will eventually be broken down and used for energy. So our fourth and final special circulation is the fetal circulation. The fetal circulation is a variation of the entire adult circulation, but with a few additional shortcuts and shunts that will allow for blood to bypass areas of lesser importance. So to understand this, we must first understand that the lungs and the digestive organs in the fetus are not functional during development. What this means for the fetus is that blood that is passing through the lungs will not pick up oxygen, and blood passing through the digestive organs will not pick up nutrients. We will still need to supply blood to the digestive organs and also provide blood for the lungs through its systemic branches. However, as the lungs aren't providing any oxygen to our blood, the goal of the fetal circulation will be to bypass the pulmonary circulation. As we are discussing our circulation during development, it is important to mention that the fetus will gain all of the oxygen and nutrients that it will need from the mother's placenta. The umbilical vein and the umbilical arteries are going to be the structures that make up the umbilical cord. And it is in the structures that compose the umbilical cord that oxygenated and nutrient-rich blood will pass to the fetus, and deoxygenated blood containing waste products will travel back from the fetus to the mother so that the mother can clean that blood and reoxygenate it to pass it back out to the infant. The umbilical vein specifically is the structure that will carry nutrients and oxygen-rich blood out to the fetus, and our two umbilical arteries will carry waste and deoxygenated blood from the fetus back to the placenta. So we will see that the fetal circulation will mostly represent the adult circulation with a few very important differences. I have mentioned before that the fetal circulation's main purpose is to provide vascular shunts to the cardiovascular system that allow for blood to bypass areas of lesser importance. And we will see three structures in particular that will facilitate these vascular shunts. Our three structures of importance are the ductus venosus, the foramen ovale, and the ductus arteriosus. We will now see that the umbilical vein is going to take oxygenated and nutrient-rich blood out from the mother's placenta through the umbilical cord and into the fetus. The first vascular shunt that we will see will facilitate the quick passage of blood from the umbilical vein directly to go into the right atrium. The structure that facilitates this is known as the ductus venosus. Once blood has made its way into the right atrium, we will also find another vascular shunt that will allow blood to go from the right atrium directly into the left atrium. The foramen ovale is a hole in the wall of the right atrium that allows for the connection between these two chambers. By shunting blood from the right atrium to the left atrium, we completely bypass the pulmonary circulation. And the last vascular shunt that we're going to see here is a direct pathway from the pulmonary trunk into the aorta. This also gives us the ability to completely bypass the pulmonary circulation. We must remember that since the lungs are not functional, the baby is not going to be breathing its own air. So as there's no point for pumping blood through the pulmonary circulation, we can bypass it altogether to ensure efficiency in the fetal circulation. So we can see a diagram of the fetal circulation shown on this slide. And while at first this might look quite extensive, I want to assure you that you actually know most of the information that's already on this slide. As we've already discussed the pathway that blood takes as it moves through the heart, you will see that this is a pathway that you're already quite familiar with. So let's go ahead and get started right here. We know that the inferior vena cava is going to take blood directly into the right atrium. And the right atrium will directly take blood through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, blood's going to enter into the pulmonary trunk and go through the pulmonary arteries into the lungs and back out to the pulmonary veins. The pulmonary veins will dump into the left atrium, and the left atrium through the bicuspid valve will enter into the left ventricle. From here, blood will get pumped out of the aortic valve into the aorta, and the aorta gives rise to our systemic circulation, which will eventually meet back here at the inferior vena cava. So in fact, over half of the boxes on this slide are just denoting the adult circulation, so we don't have to go and relearn that. The circulation that we've learned so far will be present in the fetus. However, we are going to see some major differences here that will allow for shunting of blood that we do not see in the adult circulation. So let's come down here and start from the placenta. The umbilical cord will contain the umbilical vein and the umbilical arteries. And the umbilical vein is going to carry good blood out to the umbilical region of the fetus. This good blood is depicted here in red. And as the umbilical vein enters into the fetus, blood in the umbilical vein will be directly shunted into the inferior vena cava through the ductus venosus. This is the first of 3 vascular shunts. Once blood enters into the inferior vena cava, it will enter into the right atrium, and it can go 2 ways. Of course, it could go into the right ventricle, into the pulmonary trunk, and make its way through the pulmonary circulation to meet back at the left atrium. This is possible as the circulation we've already learned is present in the fetus. However, there's no point to taking blood through here since there's no oxygenation taking place. So by having the foramen ovale connect the right atrium to the left atrium, we're able to quickly shunt blood from the right side of the heart to the left side of the heart. This gives us the ability to bypass the pulmonary circulation. From here, this blood can enter into the left ventricle, go into the aorta, and then enter to the systemic circulation, which will eventually meet up with the umbilical arteries that will take that deoxygenated blood back to the placenta to be cleaned by the mother. Now the last difference that we need to account for starts over here. I've already mentioned that the foramen ovale is a vascular shunt from the right atrium to the left atrium, but I also mentioned that blood very well could go into the right ventricle. And any blood that does go into the right ventricle is not going to make its way back into the right atrium. So this blood is going to have to continue along this pathway. Blood from the right ventricle could very well go through the pulmonary trunk and eventually make its way through the entire pulmonary circulation. This is, again, very possible. But there's one other vascular shunt that will connect our pulmonary trunk to the aorta, and that is known as the ductus arteriosus. Any blood that didn't enter the foramen ovale will make its way over here to the pulmonary trunk, and it will have a second opportunity to shunt through the pulmonary circulation through this ductus arteriosus directly into our systemic circulation. So aside from the placenta, the umbilical vein, and the umbilical arteries, we only have 3 differences that we need to impose on our adult circulation. We have the ductus venosus, which is going to shunt blood from the umbilical vein into the inferior vena cava. We have the foramen ovale that's going to shunt blood from the right atrium into the left atrium. And we also have the ductus arteriosus, which will shunt blood from the pulmonary trunk into the aorta. So it goes without saying that these vascular shunts need to go away when the baby is born. Once the baby's born, the pulmonary circulation is going to kick up and it will be eating on its own. So bypassing the pulmonary circulation is no longer a good idea. So these vascular shunts will all close up at birth. But specifically, what we will find in the adult circulation are remnants of the fetal circulation. In particular, the foramen ovale will close and become a structure known as the fossa ovalis. This is an indentation on the inside of the wall of the right atrium. The ductus arteriosus will eventually become the ligamentum arteriosum, which will be found connecting the pulmonary trunk to the aorta, just like its previous counterpart. And the ductus venosus will become a ligament on the liver known as the ligamentum venosum. A little trick to remember each of these is ovale sounds similar to ovalis, arteriosus sounds very similar to arteriosum, and venosus sounds very similar to venosum. That's one way that we can associate these structures with their remnants. We will also in fact find remnants of the umbilical arteries and remnants of the umbilical vein as well. The umbilical vein becomes a structure known as the ligamentum teres, and the umbilical arteries become what are known as the medial umbilical ligaments. This slide will show you the side-by-side comparison of the fetal circulation with the newborn circulation, which is essentially the equivalent of the adult circulation. Starting here at the placenta, the umbilical cord will project off from this and eventually enter the fetus through the umbilicus. The umbilical cord, you can see, is labeled here, containing the umbilical arteries and the umbilical vein. The umbilical vein will take oxygenated blood out through the umbilicus and into the fetus. And here you can see the umbilical vein and its vascular shunt, the ductus venosus, as that takes blood into the right atrium. From the right atrium, there are two pathways. We can go directly from the foramen ovale, or perhaps we could enter into the right ventricle. Blood entering into the foramen ovale will end up in the left atrium, and blood entering into the right ventricle will get pumped up into the pulmonary trunk, where it can either enter the ductus arteriosus and end up in the aorta, or the systemic circulation, or perhaps it can go out to the pulmonary arteries and course through the lungs. This, of course, is unnecessary. Blood that ended up here in the left atrium gets pumped into the left ventricle and out of the aorta into the systemic circulation. From here, blood will be able to access the two umbilical arteries that will wrap around the umbilical cord and take bad blood back to the placenta. Now we will be able to see in this newborn circulation the remnants of all of those structures that were shunting blood here in the fetal circulation. Specifically, we'll no longer see the umbilical vein. This becomes what's known as the ligamentum teres. And the ligamentum teres can be found connecting to the ligamentum venosum, just as the umbilical vein connected to the ductus venosus, and this ligamentum venosum can be found on the liver. We'll find the fossa ovalis in the wall of the right atrium, and we'll find the ligamentum arteriosum connecting the pulmonary trunk to the aorta. The umbilical arteries will have become the medial umbilical ligaments, which do attach to the umbilicus. So despite no longer having the vascular shunts, our adult circulation will show us remnants of these fetal structures that were once used to shunt blood in the fetal circulation. The last thing that I do want to mention here is you'll notice that we do have the hepatic portal vein. Another depiction of the hepatic portal vein can be shown right here. This is going to receive blood flow from the gastric vein, the splenic vein, as well as the inferior mesenteric vein and the superior mesenteric vein. You can see that these are going to be the systemic capillary beds that will offload oxygen to our digestive organs to supply them with energy. This blood passing through the hepatic portal vein is going to be oxygen poor but nutrient rich. So we're going to take this blood through the liver where we can offload the nutrients and process them for energy later on. The hepatic veins will eventually dump into the inferior vena cava, and we'll see this make its way back up to the right side of the heart to go back to the pulmonary circulation, where this blood will be reoxygenated in one of our other special circulations. This will conclude our lab presentation on the special circulations. I will see you all for our next lab presentation where we will cover the respiratory system.